any wargame, anytime.
Well, hello everyone. It is another episode of Any War Game Anytime. It's myself, and I am joined by Sam. Boz is out looking for that millionaire to support us so we can all quit our jobs. And we've got a special guest as well. But for now, Sam, how you doing, man?
You know what? I'm doing okay. Uh, Another day. Nothing fancy to add there. Just doing okay.
Yeah, I mean, really, who cares about the rest of our lives? It's the war games.
It's like I
Right.
could complain, but like, who
Yeah.
cares, right? I mean,
And it's like we do this all for fun. We do this all to really like maybe even like asking the questions. Just like honestly, war
because
games.
this is secretly the thing that gives us meaning in life,
Of
right? I mean, this
course,
this
of
is the
course.
only thing that we derive value in our own existence from, right? So it's like this is
You
why we're
say
just
it.
completely legit and serious.
I mean, you see,
Absolute
there's
professionals
definitely some
here.
truth. Well, there's some truth to that. I'm not gonna no. Well, for myself, I actually just got off the one-page rules call. With 3.3 coming out. That's bit of a different thing, but it's going to be interesting when we start talking about one-page rules and that with our particular conversation with our guest today. So with that, we got Justin. He came on before. Good to have him back, man. How you doing, Justin?
Hey guys, I'm also doing pretty good. Maybe
That's
a
good.
little more than fine.
Now you went to Lone Wolf this past year. I didn't get a chance to go. It's just how it works. How was Lone Wolf, man?
It was a lot of fun. It was thundering so loud it would silence the room sometimes with the imagine like
Oh.
90 something people, and it was just these very large thunders, but
Did
it was a
the
lot of fun.
did
Because
the Brits come this year, or did they
yeah,
or
yeah,
they did?
at least two. I mean, so many people there are kind of new to me, but
Gotcha.
I know we had the UK Master and he played against the US Master in round one.
Oh,
Oh, did they have a challenge set up for that?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
nice,
That's a
nice.
that's a thing for Kings of War GTs that we do is that you'll have people who will challenge each other online ahead of time, and that'll be your round one matchup if you accept the challenge. So
Yeah,
Yes.
actually challenged one of our locals, Jesse, and he was the best general last year, I think, at Lone Wolf.
Yes. Yeah.
And he is now the best overall for the first time. He was for a while the best general, never the best overall. And
Oh, Jesse Garrett. Oh,
yeah,
great,
yeah, first
great. That's
best overall.
awesome. A
Um,
local Austin guy. That's
I
terrific.
like to say I was a little part of that. I lost to him 20-0 in the first round,
That's awesome.
which was randomly generated as a kill scenario.
Well, that's
oh, just
awesome.
lovely, isn't it?
Yeah, I hated missing Lone Wolf. Just unfortunate that didn't get a chance to go. That's just how it works. But and we so me, Sam, and Justin, we do talk about one page rules, but we're also Kings of War people. Now myself, just full transparency, I haven't played Kings of War for several months now. I've been getting involved a lot more in the weeds and OPR, especially on some of their Grimdark and some of the competitive scene. There's a lot of work that's happening there, and I'd like to play Kings of War, but I'm also Y- you know, I
So
it's
only
nice to-
24 hours in the day.
well, yeah, and it is nice to have a little bit of a break. Like I've played Kings of War as my solo war game for many years. And it's nice to play get back into the 40K-ish grimdark future, so it's nice to like I said, it's a nice welcome change for me.
Yeah, so
So
great. This is a great time to be on a break from Kings of War too. Because it has
well,
issues right now.
I haven't played since the new drop. I had played since the Twilight Kin Codex happened, and I don't know. It wasn't a big incentive for me to get back into King's War, although I think I will.
I,
Now,
I have I have played since the last drop, and let me tell you, I don't think I've ever lost so badly and felt like that nothing I did in that game actually mattered. So I've been kind of on a break from Kings of War since the last tournament I went to, because it was just kind of the disparity between the competitive levels of lists have just grown so high that I think I'm gonna take a break from this until things get sorted out.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe that does mean backing off a little on the competitive side. But luckily, Justin has come on today and he is going to solve all of Kings of War's problems. Justin, you've been doing some research and some writing, and you have got a solution to our problem. So, and that is, Justin, drum roll, you want to integrate a point system into Kings of War, and you've got a pretty interesting take on it. So, we'll let you kind of deep dive into that, but sort of to ask you a question, maybe this is a question you would get if you bring this up, is why do we need a point system? You mean what is such a big deal about a point system? I mean, we're smart, we've got big brains. Why do we need a point system?
Well, I guess it's really just to keep a game fair, right? You want to make sure that when you bring an army, that the opponent you're going to play against is somewhere in the same vicinity of the army you're playing, right? You don't want to bring a skirmish to a grand battle, right? You show up with 2 regiments, and your opponents show up with 20 hordes and 5 monsters. You're not going to be in for a very
'Cause You
entertaining game.
you can always replace the inherent point system of a game with dollars, right? I brought more toys than you.
Yeah.
But well, I mean, but that isn't what Kings of War. Kings of War is a fair and balanced, perfectly balanced game. I mean, why do we need a point system? We already have a perfectly balanced game, Justin. I mean, or do you not feel the case that it's not balanced? Or do you feel a point system could bring us there? What do you think?
Well, I think going back to what Sam had said the last time he played, I mean, this is kind of true for any game, is you have to know how to play the game. And that's more than what's written in the rules. Um, but you find out pretty quick that there's like certain types of units are just strictly better than other types of units. So you can build an army that looks perfectly fine. And then when you hit the table, you find out that it's just outclassed by what your opponents are bringing. And it's like at some level, it's just knowing to play the game. Like I played a guy at a tournament this year that mainly a historicals player, so he had built like a halflings army, but it looked like a historicals army, just a bunch of troops of crossbowmen or something. And like the way he set it up, he was playing like historicals, which is Kings of War is a little more arcadey, you might say, than a historical, and he just couldn't. He didn't have counters. It just didn't work what he played and how he was playing. Um, and it kind of goes beyond that. So like I coming from Warhammer, I played Lizardmen and I used a lot of skinks.
Yeah.
And the Kings of War equivalent is the Gakota in Salamander's list. And whenever I try to build a list with Gakota in it, you just find out that
They're terrible.
yeah, for the price per whatever you're measuring, the infantry Gakota, you're like, well, I might as well just do the mounted ones because they're basically the same price for the same amount of combat acuity. And then like, well, if I'm going to bring them for a little bit more, I can get a lot more value out of the salamander versions of those. So if you look and no one plays Gakotas in their salamander list, it's a salamander list full of salamanders, and they have this whole branch. There's like a whole bunch of units that are they're just unplayable. And you look at them, you're like, okay, well, they're faster, they don't hit as hard, but they're cheaper. So you can kind of talk yourself into why they're there and what roles they might play. But for any role you're trying to fill, there's another unit that fills it for less points or just as many points, or more points, but you get way more value out of them.
Yeah.
And what you end up finding out when you look at like the spam lists, the lists that like people hate, but they also you kind of want to see them play. They're almost always flying hordes of large cavalry, and they'll get abused, and then the rules committee will fix it. They'll nerf the unit, and then the next flying horde of large cavalry will get spammed, and they'll nerf that, and the next one.
Oh,
So like,
and let's so and just so those we may have people who aren't Kings of War people, let's sort of preface this with let's put this in a context of what Justin, and you can always correct me if I'm wrong, but let's sort of quickly tie into the context of sort of why you want to talk about a point system and why a point system for Kings of War may be a lot more important than other games. And it's so there's a couple of things. One, Kings of War, as you are mentioning, spamming, they have a very different unlock system than, for instance, like Warhammer, right? Where I'm not saying that Warhammer, the old world, is balanced. It's clearly not. But there is a lot more room for imbalances in some of the units because you have caps. You can only bring so many points worth of these rares or these specials, and you have to bring a certain number of troops. So, like what you're talking about, Justin, in that sort of context, having a unit like a skink, which is a little more inefficient, in a unit like Warhammer makes a little more sense because you technically have
because
to
you're required to take a certain
are
percentage
required to bring.
of those core units, right? Which is kind of the historical equivalent of like your peasant levies that you kind of have to have, to get your actual fighters into position.
So that's and so Kings of War, yeah, by contrast, it has a very loose unlocking system. I know that they have an unlock system, but just in reality, I think, especially for many of the better armies, there is no unlock system. You can basically bring what you want.
You can take an entire army of Pegasus Knights. There's nothing that
Well, even not Pegasus,
restricts you from doing that.
you
I
really
mean,
can bring, and the unlock system in Kings of War, it's loose, it's loose enough that you really can bring these sorts of armies. So that's the first point. The other point I think that contextually we have to talk about Kings of War is unlike Warhammer, even unlike OPR, which really doesn't present itself as a competitor. The owner of OPR specifically said, I'm not interested in making this a competitive game. But that isn't Kings of War. Kings of War, sort of its main selling point, I've always felt, is they pitch themselves as a competitive game. This isn't what Warhammer does. To whatever GW's credit are, they've Games Workshop has never pitched the old world or 8th edition as a competitive game. The
Yeah.
community has made it competitive, but Games Workshop hasn't. So
whereas Kings of War kind of from its real inception has been trying to attract the tournament players.
yeah, it is a selling point that any Kings of War player is going to say that, right? They're going to say, play us because we're a competitive game.
This was literally the reasons that when I
Right.
after leaving Warhammer, for years, I got talked back into playing Kings of War on these kind of lines that look, it's a much more balanced game. The company doesn't do XYZ that GW used to do. The rules are much more stable. And that was the things that people
Yeah.
told me to kind of get me back into the game.
So yeah, so let's preface what you're going to talk about in a context. Kings of War is a selling point. We're competitive. Two, Kings of War has an unlock system which is very loose. That puts a lot more owners on Kings of War units all to be balanced, right? If you have no sort of troop tax or things, then really all the units have to be balanced because you can really bring just about anything. You can spam lists, but why spam something if everything is balanced? I think, Justin, you may be getting to this. You wouldn't have to spam everything if certain units weren't better than others. So, real quick, just to make sure, I want to make sure me and you were on the same points. then I'll let you sort of continue on with the point system. So I'm sorry to take your time. I just want to sort of let's kind of quickly set this context and then kind of give Justin the floor. Yeah.
There's another important difference in Kings of War in that the most of the time you're playing it, your main goal is not to kill all of your opponent's units. Where Warhammer I know had some scenarios in it, but I don't think I ever played a Warhammer game that wasn't kill first and then some side bonus points for other things. Kings of War, most scenarios you play don't care about kill points at all, or you'll use kill points as your tiebreaker or like as a bonus point. For the most part, you're claiming objectives or claiming board sides or trying to get to a certain side of the board or something. You have some objective you're both trying to accomplish. So killing things isn't even the most important part of a unit, which kind of makes some ideas more complicated, but also more important to have a game balance. But I think it's also why you can kind of look at a unit that is not good at fighting, but is fast and kind of cheap and say, well, it has value where this other unit that's only a little more expensive is better at fighting, but slower, say. But still that fast, cheap unit is not taken by anybody. Which seems to me to be a symptom of some sort of problem. And I think, I think I have an idea of what that is and an idea of how to solve that. It's not a little solution, it's a big thing, but it's just math, really.
It may be a big thing, but it's certainly doable. I mean,
Yeah, so
I've been in
Justin's done some. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I mean, I've been in one-page rules land for the past most of this past year. I've been a lot more just working on, and they have a point system. The point system isn't perfect. The point system um, gets tweaked. I think that there was a call today. He's even making some tweaks to the point system, but there's a point system, and that point system is also transparent. They have a custom army builder where you can build not only custom units, you can build custom abilities and use their own formulas that they use.
Yeah, it's because being formulaic is a really important part of that, right? The fact that it's not just like there's an actual mathematical basis for why things in OPR are pointed the way they are. And again, sometimes it's not perfect,
But you
but
can see it.
you can
It's
see
much
it.
easier. You can
And
actually see the
it's
imperfections. It's very easy once you start digging into the formulas to sort of see, oh wait, this ability is slightly different. Well, it's very different when you don't have a points. How can even Justin, what I'm hearing you saying, it's sort of nebulous. You think like, we're using all this secondhand knowledge to determine what units are better because what units are spammed, right? Is that correct, Justin?
Yeah, and Kings of War has a point system. It's a little opaque in how it's generated, but you can, for the most part, backwards solve for some things. So, for example, you get this a lot with magic items, right? You look at a magic item and you say, this item, say, adds +1 crushing strength. And you could look at the price and say, well, that's overpriced because I can look at units that have crushing strength or don't have crushing strength that are similar otherwise and figure out like how much that ability is worth. And so you've actually seen items through the versions of Kings of War change prices that maybe they've decided this ability is underpriced or overpriced. So they've changed some of the items pricing. So like people are pretty happy with like the value of crushing strength is 30, let's say. And they're pretty happy with that. And so when they see a unit that comes out and they're like, the only difference between these units is the crushing strength, but this unit's only 10 points more expensive. They're getting a discount on that crushing strength. And that's what people are comfortable with. That's kind of how it works. Like there is a formula with some wishy-washiness, and it tries to scale based on the size of the unit. So as you go from a troop to a regiment to a horde, the price you pay for an ability like crushing strength will go up. But that's only within a unit and the size of the unit, and that happens across all of the units. But the problem that I found is that when you compound abilities, they make each other better. The value of those abilities goes up as you add them together, and that can't be reflected by a
They
stat
synergize. Yeah, they
a static
synergize.
price. Yeah. So like
Yeah.
if you're good at hitting things, you like so, oh I did some math out, right? And I came up with like just taking a generic unit in King's War terms, it hits on fours and has a defense of 4. So it's right in the middle. It's a generic unit. And if it fights itself, um I don't have it in front of me. It does like 3 wounds, let's say. And if you make it have crushing 1, just a little better at fighting, it does 4 wounds. It gets 1 wound better on average, right? Doing that math out. If instead of giving it +1 crush, you give it what was the other thing I gave it? Oh,
Plus
you
one
make
to
it,
plus
you
one
make
to
it
hit.
+1 to hit. So you give it a hit on 3+ instead of 4+, that improves it from 3 wounds to 4 wounds as well. So you could look at that math and say, well, +1 to hit and +1 crush have the same value. In this context, there's other reasons
Yeah. No, we get you.
some of these abilities,
You're
but
using an example. Yeah, we
in
get
just this context, they're each worth +1 to hit. So whatever the value or +1 wound, so whatever the value of a wound is, they should be about the same price point, you would think.
Yeah.
So if you gave someone +1 to hit and +1 crush, and it's still fighting the same 4 defense unit, you would think, well, the crush gives it +1 wound,
right.
the +1 to hit gives it +1 wound, so it should go from 3 wounds to 5 wounds.
Right.
But if you run that math out on average, you're going to get something like 5.2 wounds.
Yeah.
You're going to get a little bit more than each of those individual abilities. So if you said those abilities were, say, 10 points, and you get both of them and you paid 20 points for both abilities, you actually got 22 points worth of value out of them.
And that may be small. And so for one, okay, and this
But
is something that we have to just, you may think as the viewer to think, okay, that's a minor thing. But when you take that small differential and you put it in a kind of a rule system like Kings of War, where you can spam out that unit many times over, that small percent change in points can sort of get magnified very quickly.
because let's say you're taking a
Like suppose
20
yeah,
a
go ahead.
2300 point game, which is pretty standard in Kings of War, and using this kind of, getting an extra 0.2 essentially points worth of value in a 2300 game, that basically winds up with 460 points worth of value in a larger game. So when you scale it up to the scale that of a full battle, like, you're actually getting significant value. And so what this creates is, between armies and such and lists and whatever that can utilize this versus the ones that can't, is it's almost like you're playing with literally playing with less stuff, because the value of your opponent's stuff or your stuff is just on average higher than your.
Well, it isn't this how, and so we won't get, we'll post the link to Justin's. Justin has got several algorithms and he could run it through. You can look at that. But for brevity's sake, what you're ultimately saying, you can correct me if I'm wrong. What I read through your calculations are that, and it does play out sort of, I think, in Kings of War. What your hypothesis is that units that have a lot of really good abilities and special abilities in one are much better than 2 or 3 of the other ones, because all these special abilities and extra stats are pushed together in sort of a linear way, a static way, right? 10 points, 10 points, 10 points. And each of these special abilities are actually giving 12, right? 12
Yeah,
points,
but
12 points,
because
12
when
points,
they're
12 points, 12
combined
points.
in certain
And
ways, right?
and we see this, what you would say is you see this. This is your explanation about why you see spamming of a unit that has flying and melee 3 and def 5 and a lot of attacks and crush 2 and elite or vicious, right? That unit in the current paradigm, I guess, of the wishy-washy Kings of War rules is the problem, correct?
Yeah, and it's actually like when you start doing the math, it's a small number, like I said, like 0.2. But as you add more things, that gap gets bigger. So what happens is, of course, a unit with all the abilities costs more, right? You're paying like 300 points for that unit, where like a unit of infantry, a little unit of infantry might be 100 points or 80 points, right? So of course you're paying more for the thing, but as you stack all of these abilities on it and you're paying these linear prices for them, the value is multiplying. So when you get this unit that hits on 3, crush 2, defense 5, flying, nimble, and you're paying 300 points, you're paying 3 times as much for that than you would a 100-point regiment of regular human infantry, but you're actually getting like 9 times the value.
That's right.
So you're paying 300 where you should be paying 900
I
for
think
that, for the value you're getting out of it.
yeah, you had one where it was like, I think you equated it out to like a flying unit, an elite flying unit should be like what, 600 or 700 points? Is that what you said, Justin, in your article? It was something
Yeah,
pretty
it sounds, yeah, because I remember it was something, yeah, I'm looking
something up there, six or
the
700 points. Yeah. Um,
charts here.
Base stuff off this. Now, obviously, there's in a game with tactical kind of stuff. You can't actually make a unit that costs that much and have it be usable. But you also need to kind of the counterpoint is what you end up with now in Kings of War is you have a whole bunch of armies and a whole bunch of units in the game which are just basically not usable because they're strictly better versions of them. And
well,
because of what they do is just outclassed so hard by what, other versions of this thing do, uh that so it's kind of almost better to have the 700 point Uber unit be unplayable versus all of the 80 point infantry units or whatever. Again, not actually using
But I mean,
actual
there's a
numbers
lot
here.
of ways if you accept that my math is right, like, and some units are just ridiculously undercosted, there's a lot of ways you can fix it. Fix that problem. I mean, one is you can use, like, I mean, points are make believe, right? You could say a 700 point unit is unplayable, but that's one because you're like, oh, well, we play it 2,000 points. But also, you could say that 700 points only a 70 point unit, and the 100 point unit is a 10 point unit, and like you can, if as long as you're pricing things appropriately for the value they give you, then you can set those points any way you want. You need one unit that's your like baseline, and everything else is some multiple of that. And you can figure out what the actual points values are from there. And sure, there'll be some like rounding, and you might get like 1 or 2 points of value out of something. That's kind of inconsequential. The problem is when things are so overpriced. But there's the other part of Kings of War, and this is why I wanted to bring that up earlier, was you don't score points by killing your opponent's units. You score points by claiming objectives. And units have a thing called unit strength.
yep.
So the more unit strength you have, the better you are at holding an objective. And if you have no unit strength, you can't hold an objective. So when you factor unit strength into the value of a unit, right? And you say, well, a unit that can kill so many things and it can hold objectives, now it's worth even more points, right? And
And that was one of the
you
big
can
changes
start.
they made from second edition to third edition is they kind of got rid of a lot of the unit strength penalties to certain types of units.
Well,
And they made unit strength across the board kind of get higher. And what that ended up with is again, now you're flying hordes, which used to be kind of your one weakness was you had less unit strength, because flying used to kind of confer one less unit strength to a unit. That weakness is gone now. And so the value now of those units has increased beyond the point where they're where
well,
it's to the point where a unit's is better than the sum of their parts.
Well, and let me push back a little bit, Justin, about what you said, because I felt you were, especially coming from where I've been in OPR land the past year, and I have to sort of push back in that you say Kings of War has a formula with a little wishy-washy. I just don't, I think that's a little too generous. I think it's just arbitrary. I mean, as best I can tell, I've looked at some of these differentials, and some of these units are so off even
Well,
side by
there's
side their
so
stats. To me, I don't even think of
there's
this formula anymore. It's just to me, as best I can tell, it's just arbitrary.
Well,
Um,
I made a
it starts from a baseline of arbitrary. And so like there are certain classes of units. There's an infantry unit, there's a berserker unit. So you can't compare those. When you know what a berserker unit looks like and an infantry or regular infantry looks like, those have baselines, and then they have baseline like here's what those should cost. And then on top of that, they start nickel and diming their abilities. So if you take a berserker with some abilities and compare it to a not berserker with some abilities, it's gonna look like nonsense.
yeah, but if it was just nickel and dimes, that's one thing. So one, as you already said, Justin, the nickel and dimes add up. And two, I think it's more quarters these days. I think the changes are getting into the quarter range, and
Well,
I
that was
think, and
that was a because they're done.
I would just finish up and sort of saying what you say, Justin, which is that it plays out in the army lists when you have people bringing one or two of the same unit in their army. I mean, doesn't isn't that sort of these players are doing that for a reason, right?
Yeah, and I think it's less what they're bringing and more what they're not bringing.
Yeah, that's
The
good too.
units, and because they're just you can look at it one of two ways. Some units are just way undercosted, or some units are way overcosted.
Mhm.
And if you got that balanced, if you had units, and so the main thesis I have is that if you calculate the value of a unit, whatever that you deem that to be, but the value of the output of a unit,
That's right. Yep.
and that's what you should be pricing. So what that would mean is a point of crush on one unit might cost more than a point of crush on another unit. But in the end, the value of them come out, and where does that value come from? So like if you have a unit that you're like, oh no, this unit's unplayably expensive, well, you start tweaking the unit and you say, well, what if we give it a lower defense? Does that make its value kind of come closer to a playable unit? What if we make it so what if this unkillable unit that bulldozes everything doesn't score at all? Does that make its value come down to a world where it's playable? It has a role, it kills things, but
Yeah.
it can't score, so you need other things to score. And maybe certain classes of units that aren't good at fighting are good at scoring.
Or this is this is a shocking thing right here. You just do what other war games do, where you have a troop tax. Basically, you have a built-in system where turns out you can't just take all angels or all Pegasus Knights or all whatever. You have to have your core infantry to carry all the supplies and whatnot.
Kings of War has the tools to do that. They
And they just don't do it. They just don't do it.
chose, yeah. I mean, you could say it's
because people complained about it online when they tried to implement that. When they first implemented third edition, they actually had a lot of those units that were historically problems were irregular now, which meant that they didn't, be based on the unlock system, they were a lot more restrictive in your ability to take them. And people complained about it, and they backtracked on all of that. And
I don't
to
know.
where now it's like nothing relevant is irregular.
I've never
It's
even
it's it's
felt
it's a, it's a
irregular.
useless rule. It's
But
a useless rule.
yeah, irregular to me. I've the unlock system in Kings of War is so loose. Even irregular powerful units are really easy to get.
It depended on the army, right? Like, because then there would be these issues where you would have certain armies, irregular was really restrictive because and then certain armies where it didn't matter at all, right? I mean,
it's still some armies have unlock problems where all of their playables are monsters and characters,
mhm.
and basically like the things that unlock anything are not super playable, or the playable ones are so expensive you can't get enough of them. And some armies have no problems at all with unlocks because they're playable. The core units are super playable.
So
Yeah,
let's sort of hit something that I think you're hitting something else, and we're gonna have this come back and talk more, but I think you two are saying something as well, which is that if there's just you probably don't need a point system if there is maybe 2 or 3 armies where sort of the variables involved in running these test units against each other are small. But as you increase the number of armies, as you increase the variables, and all of a sudden all these armies have their little arbitrary tweaks, it sort of without a point system becomes impossible to balance. But then look at a system like OPR, which not only has a lot of armies, but has the custom army builder, where you can literally go and you can have a near infinite amount of armies that people can just build scratch. But because it's a point system, that really keeps everything sort of broadly speaking in line. Is that something
I
as well
do
as the
think
number
I
of
do think
armies?
you'd find these same issues. The difference in OPR, I think, is there's less roles, right? Because in Kings of War, you have a roll to hit and a roll to wound, but OPR, you have like the quality roll, right? It's kind of the one roll.
You also
So
have less dice too in general in OPR, right?
right, so
You're not rolling as many dice.
there's less
It's
so there's less
some bigger
abilities
games
because
it
there's
can
less
be.
places to put
Yeah.
the abilities, right?
Mhm.
Because in Kings, you can adjust your to hit roll and
Mhm.
you can adjust your to wound roll, but in OPR, it's really just the one roll. So you have half as many things, so it won't get as explosive. But I
Yeah,
think you'd
like
still
they're
find that the more abilities you add, the price would go up, but it wouldn't go up at the same rate as the value you're getting out of it. So you're still probably slightly better off making a unit with a bunch of abilities than making a lot of units with less abilities. If that
Mhm.
makes sense. You're gonna get more value out of one unit with a high quality and a high AP than a lot of units with low quality and low AP. Um, unless the value of having more units versus the less units balances that out, which OPR might have because of the
it
ID
does
stuff.
because of the way the activations work, where
Right.
if you have a lot more activations than your opponent, right? You get into a point where, okay, my opponent's basically done everything they can do, and I still have 4 units to you to
And in
move,
that
and that's a
case,
huge
it
advantage.
might go the other way,
Yeah,
where
that's kind
the
of one of the
value of
balancing points.
having
Yeah.
many units, like that has to be calculated into the value somehow, which it,
Well,
it's it's
and
it's kind of behind the scenes happening, but it could be that having a lot of units with low abilities has more value than fewer units with a lot of abilities because of the activation system, which is something you're not particularly paying for. It might happen that all just balances out and like the
I
value
think
you're
I think
getting
it
from your
more
ad.
it's easy. Like this is what I would say with OPR. Is OPR a perfectly balanced game? No. But one of the things that what you're saying that we haven't hit on, and I think you are hitting on, but let's make sure we're bringing this point across. There is transparency. With a point system, you get a transparency there. In other words, if everything is pointed even in King's of War, and suppose they do adjust things here and there, tweak things, you then know exactly how much they're adjusting things. Right now,
And
you really
why,
don't
right?
know how much they're adjusting things. In OPR, you can actually, by digging into the formulas, you can really see where the balance can be. In other words, it's easier to actually tweak the formulas more as you are able to look at the formulas and dig into them more and dig into them more, right? Where
Whereas, yeah, like in Kings of War, there are theoretically kind of there's theoretically a formula used to point units when they, that's known kind of by the rules committee and such. But that's a closed, they've refused to
huh,
release that to the general public and to, normal players. And again, so what you wind up with in Kings of War, and this I get really frustrated with this, is you have a kind of an inner circle and an outer circle where you have a certain inner circle group of people who have access to information that the rest of us don't. And it's really frustrating you know, at times, because it's like, I don't understand why they don't just release the formula, um, assuming they're doing things ethically. Which I mean, the answer is that they're not, right? I mean, the answer is that they have a formula and they just don't apply it when they release units, and they don't want players to know that.
Well, and
And
the
so like
reason,
that's a problem. That's a problem.
so, and the other thing about a point system that we see in OPR is one, they actually, again, they released the new version today, 3.3. And the owner was like, oh, yeah, we adjusted some points in our formula. And what happened? Because they made some tweaks in one place to a formula, all those unit prices just flowed directly to the units. They're not going to each of these different armies and having to manually tweak points. Like you said, from a maintenance perspective, Justin, when you have that point system, that is one of
So
the reasons that I think Kings of War has a problem adjusting points. They can't physically probably go into all these armies and finagle the points, right? If they had a point system, this could all just sort of auto-magically happen just through the formula, right? And just spit out new point values. What do you think about that?
I believe there exists a Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets that calculates points for things based on, like I said, it's a complicated formula, kind of like there's different bands and stuff, but it's like
it's incorrectly done,
they're
and
doing it.
it's not,
But I
and it's
think the
not correctly
core,
applied.
like I said, I think the core, the direction that it's coming from, which is the same direction Warhammer comes from, and just because that's kind of where this all comes from, and wherever Warhammer comes from, I'm sure it did it too, is you give value to abilities, you apply abilities to a unit, and you add all those values together and you get the unit's value. And I mean, I have some theories of why the King's War one's a little out of whack even with that, but even if it wasn't, um, the more abilities you stack on, which I think with like the Twilight or elves in general, the problem I have with elves in general, when you have like elite across the board or vicious, something that lets you re-roll your
Mm.
ones, like that ability is added to you hit on threes, added to you have a unit a value of crush. When you start adding those, like they by
Ancient,
default are
ancient as
yeah,
well.
and Bane Chant right there, like gives you that already, like gives that to a unit that didn't have it. So that the value of those units, the value of the output of those units is higher than the points you pay for them. And since they get some of that kind of for free, they're all by default a little overvalued.
Yeah, it's the
And
same.
there's a
It's the
lot of,
same
I mean,
issues I've had with.
once you have the formula and you see these outputs, there's a lot of ways you tweak it and you say,
Right.
so
Yep.
one ability they do kind of a good job of, well, there's two, and they're similar, right? So there's Night Stalkers have this ability stealthy. So when you shoot at them, you get -1, and everyone hates it. I don't hate it. I play Night Stalkers, but their units, most of their units have defense 4. So in a different army that doesn't have stealthy, their like big knight units would have defense 5. And that because math the combat dice rolling is all multiplicative, it doesn't matter where that -1 comes from. If I have a higher defense or you get -1 to hit me, the math is the same. Another army that does it is the underwater army. So their
Trident
units
Realms,
all
yeah.
have ensnare, where you get -1 to hit in melee, but they also have defenses of like 3+ across the board. Because normally, if you didn't have ensnare, your like normal units would have defense of 4.
But this still creates issues. Uh, with the issue I have with Night Stalkers in general too, right? Is that the problem you get when you apply stealthy, and the same could be said with ensnare, although ensnare is not as universally applied across Trident Realms. The problem you get with when you universally apply and snare a stealthy to an army, so -1 to hit and shooting, is that you because this Night Stalkers is going to be a certain percentage of the armies you fight, in the tournament meta or whatever. Shooting as a whole gets less valuable because you might in a 5-game tournament or a 3-game tournament or whatever, one of those or two of those games might be Night Stalkers, in which case it's just a hard counter to your entire strategy if you're a shooting list. And then it's like, so at that point, you get issues where the point values are incorrectly kind of determined because of the meta and how it shapes the meta. I think this is again an example of a time when combinations of special rules, in this case, the fact that every Night Stalker unit has stealthy. Every Night Stalker unit having stealthy creates an effect that they're not paying as enough for that stealthy because of how it kind of affects every other army.
Yeah. Well,
because other armies have access to like a couple units with stealthy, possibly. Some do, some don't. But it's usually kind of like the issue is, okay, so if I'm playing against a normal army and they have 3 units with stealthy and 5 units without stealthy, I can choose to shoot at the units that aren't stealthy usually, right? So you get to the point where stealthy is like impossible to point
yeah, but
because Night
it's not
Stalkers
Night
exist.
Stalkers anymore. I mean, we see this with, I haven't played lately, but they've had the ogres, and of course the Twilight Kin, where it's becoming now where basically certain armies can just get everything has stealthy, and it's I,
It's a
I
huge. It's a huge.
I guess
Well,
for me,
there was a point. There was somebody made a point on Facebook. I can't remember who. Not too long ago. That we got to just stop pretending that Kings of War is actually a rank and flank tactics game. It's a skirmish game with square bases, because there's no real like nothing happens to your units by taking. The only wound that matters is the wound that kills them. Your units fight at maximum efficiency, whether they have 0 wounds or 20 wounds on them. Uh, and so
well,
because we've now implemented, originally in Kings of War, where units didn't have a lot of special rules, there was a lot more kind of uniformity, and there was a lot more, or the small differences that would then matter, and then like you had to play tactically. Now, because things are so synergy, because they've introduced more things from skirmish games, where like I have this guy who gives an aura to these units to give them, these abilities. Like it's not a rank and flanks tactics game anymore. It's
well,
not. It's just because it's not a rank and flanks tactics game anymore, and I'm tired of pretending that it is.
well,
Uh, you
I don't want to get into a semantical argument about what defines a rank and flex tactics. It's fine. I'm not disagreeing with you, Sam. I'm saying some people could just say, well, that's what I think it is. I'm not interested in sort of approaching it like that. I think for me, I would say I look at Kings of like being an OPR. I could play Kings of War. I don't hate Kings of War. I did enjoy to play it here and there. I just haven't had time. But in my time in OPR, if I could go back to Kings of War, what I would say is that a point system, as you add in more armies, as you add in, Justin, like you were saying, what your article really is hitting at, which is what I think is like what I take away from your article is so important, is that complexity without a point, like as you add on more complexity, as you add on to this, it becomes impossible to manage the armies. Kings of War, if they want to add on new units and add on new armies and do all these things, it's going to be impossible to balance it without a point system there to sort of very quickly readjust points. I go back to it in OPR, when they make a new addition, they tweak their little formulas and they press a publish button, and all the new units just get their new point changes. Right? Kings of War, because can't do that. They can't manage all these abilities. And I think what, Justin, you're trying to say, and I would suggest people read it, because when you start getting into the math, you can easily see how it becomes
we'll
impossible.
publish it
It
here for
becomes
you guys too.
impossible to manage. So a point system is the only way to really manage that scale, right? And is Kings of War going to start cutting units down to size? I don't know. I'm just that's what I would, that's what I really pick up from your writing, Justin. I'll let you sort of, you know, talk about, what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I agree. I think calculating the points based on the 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 value of the output of the unit rather than the input of the abilities you give it would lead to having to like you make your ideal unit, you'd get some points value and say, oh, that's not good, and then you'd be able to tweak them and be able to actually produce kind of unique combinations, and you don't end up just saying, well, we need our hits on 3 defense 5 flyer that flies 10, and all the units like now to counter that, every army needs that, and you end up with a lot of these kind of samey, like at some point you can't have every unit be hits on 2 elite, crush 3, moves 10, flies, right? Like all units can't be the most.
That's what happened with
So
King Men. They just gave us a flying unit fixed. Thanks.
right, exactly. But like so like if you when you have if you're valuing the output, because ultimately we're all valuing the output, right? That's what you do when you get your rule book of any game and you're playing. Like, I want to build a competitive army. What are you doing? You're looking for the value, but you're really looking for where can I get the most value for the least points, which means I can get the most of the most value, right? So what you really want, what I think what you want in the game is the price you're paying for the value is consistent. And so now you're looking at how can I combine these different forces and get the value out of how I play the army rather than what army I put on the table. Which is an argument people make about Kings of War is it's the pilot's more important than the army. But there are I agree, right? The better players will be the better players, but there are units that the better players will just never take because
The better
the better
players
players
are only
can't
gonna
beat
play
mediocre players
certain level
with
certain things.
spamming skinks, right? Because it's just the unit. And I mean, like I said, there's a lot of ways you fix this. I started my crusade started with make infantry great again. Like that's infantry. There are armies that play infantry, and there are some infantry units that you take.
Need a
But
mega.
yeah, exactly. For the most part, infantry units are either far overcosted or everything else is way undercosted.
Yeah. So cavalry in general is also on similar issues. The things that are good in Kings of War are large infantry or large cavalry.
Yeah,
You know,
because large infantry and large cavalry, generally you've got infantry, which are like low stats. Cavalry are a little better stats, right? Cavalry is going to have better armor. They're a little faster. They might hit a little better, right? Or they have better armor or they hit better, right? Then your large cav are better than your cav because you're adding more abilities to them. So each one of these levels up you go, you're adding more abilities, and those abilities are compounding. So you're actually getting more value per point, which is why the large infantry and large cavalry are the most value per point you can get. And that's what armies are based off of, is the most value. Because as you play, you find out, oh, this unit always dies and never kills anything. I have to stop taking it. This unit never dies and always kills stuff. I'm taking more of that. And you end up with
you end up with lists with very little competitive diversity, because what this is a classic fallacy that happens. And I think I've probably mentioned this on this podcast before because it's one of my things I talk about. It's a classic fallacy of game design is that when you increase the number of options, you're going to increase the diversity. But what you actually do a lot of times when you increase the number of options is you make the viable options more viable and the less viable options less viable, because now, like, what ends up happening is, the in again, I go back to second edition Kings of War Law because that's what I liked, and forgive me, this was the game I fell in love with. There were limited options in each army, and generally, not universally, but generally, every option within the army had some kind of role that it fulfilled, and it fulfilled that role in a way that wasn't just completely surpassed by something else within the army. And that's basically just gone away now. And there were also limitations in armies that, like, I play a lot of elves. I play high elves and such. In second edition high elves, right? Like you didn't have a cheap chaff unit. That was kind of one of the limitations of elves. All your stuff got elite. All your stuff was like, really, really elite, but you didn't have a cheap champion. What they do when second edition comes around is their third edition comes around, they're gonna add in the cheap chaff units now. And they again, what they did was not increase the amount of options that you could take within the list. They decreased the amount of options because the things that were better became better to a higher extent. And to now where it's like, I mean, I don't think I'd ever played a game other than when I first started playing Kings of War. Like my last game of Kings of War, I was playing elves versus dwarves, and we were both playing very shooting heavy lists. And I don't think I've ever played a game where I afterwards felt like I don't know if I could have won that game. Outside of just like massive, dice doing dice things, I don't think I could have won that game. That game was decided, when we were matched up. And my opponent
that's a tough
basically
feeling.
admitted that.
Yeah, that's a tough feeling. And I don't know exactly where Kings of War got right or wrong. And I think that one thing I think that I would suggest going and reading some of Justin's content is it gets the ball rolling. It gets us thinking, because for the future of Kings of War, I think that Justin, they have to introduce some sort of point system, because they have to have a way to just manage all these abilities and armies and everything. They gotta have a way to manage it, right, Justin? I mean, how can they can't play test all this stuff, right? I mean, hasn't that been tried already? I mean,
I think right now, which is it's a lot of confirmation bias, but because they have the online army builder, what they're able to do is they can see how often armies are built with certain units, right? So they can say they have the stats of there are no lists with this unit, or all lists have this unit. And so they'll occasionally say when they're getting pressed of something's broken, they're like, yeah, but we don't see that unit being taken.
Kind of a silly way of doing it then.
Which is silly, because like if you look at like my list, I have I don't know 900 lists.
I hope they're not doing that. That seems a pretty silly way of going.
And they also have they look at tournament, like the lists submitted to tournaments, and use those to like look at like how often our armies is one army dominate, whatever. But they're crowdsourcing that right now, which for better or worse. But I think you can come up with, like you're saying, some sort of formula that's consistent. The problem is right now, if with the, and I'll use air quotes, the formula that they currently have, it pops out numbers that then they might feel like they have to tweak a little bit, or it pops out numbers they release.
They do tweak, and they tweak it differently.
Unit's going to be broken, so let's
they clearly tweak.
Which means the formula's wrong, correct?
I agree. And I think that's what it tells them, is that means they're measuring the inputs, they're not measuring the outputs. And I think if they had a formula that measured the outputs, and there's lots of, I'm not saying there's a right way to do that. You can come up with this formula and then find out, oh, I didn't value something right, or in certain combinations, like in certain armies that have like a certain rule, maybe something is more or less valuable. Like that.
But you're not going to have that information until you have the formulas.
Right. But once you've got the formula, it just spits out your points, and you can just
that's exactly it. Yeah. You can't tweak the formula until you have a formula.
Yeah, because right now as they adjust things in Kings of War, it's based off of this, like, yes, they collect data, but it's data that's driven by certain. It's not driven by any kind of mathematical metrics. It's driven by, again, like
Gut feeling.
crowdsourcing kind of metrics where people, and so what you've wound up with long term is, and quite honestly, is you see a certain kind of ideological bent when it comes to balancing the game that is prevalent at a certain level of the game versus that's not really, that's kind of divorced from some of the realities of actual, like, regular play.
I think
Yeah.
going back to what you were like, going back to version 1, everything was simpler, right? Like +1 to hit was kind of a big deal, right? You've got your units that are regular, you've got a unit that can hit a little bit better, you got a unit that a little bit more defensive, but everything was really subtle. Like Bane Champ +1 to hit was like it was a big deal. And then version 2 comes out and there's more abilities and there's more armies that have more abilities and there's more units that have more combined abilities. And then unit 3, and you've got auras and you've got more ways to tweak things. And so it's not that there's more armies, it's that all of the armies are getting more abilities, and those abilities,
Well, there
so
are
something
models
that
too,
cost
but yeah.
100 points in version 1 and still costs 100 points in this version. But now there's just more abilities floating around. Like
Yeah.
there's
What does
this
it say? I mean, so you mentioned, and maybe this is tangential. Maybe we can pick this up on the next episode because this like we do have to start cutting this. But I'll end with this one. Maybe you can, Justin and Sam, give a quick thought about this last question. What does it say about a game that, as far as just from a core mechanics perspective, that you can spam out a lot of flying units and that is a viable army, right? I mean, like, is that a good thing? Is that a neutral thing? Is it a bad thing that a game a game can be won and won at high levels with just a whole bunch of one type of units? What do you think about that, Sam?
I think it's very clearly a bad thing. I have the unpopular opinion in the Kings of War community that we should go back to a core troop tax, something that Warhammer Fantasy did, and I think that Old World does as well. Um,
They do.
where you have to, like, look, man, like, you can't just take all the knights on the Pegasus. Sometimes you have to take your peasant spearmen because, look, man, somebody's got to carry the baggage train, and it sure as hell ain't going to be the guy on the Pegasus. And that's kind of, because that's kind of a realistic way to think about a fantasy army, and the common critique people will then raise about that. Well, it's fantasy, it shouldn't have to be realistic. It's like, if you're not basing this on some kind of level of, there's a difference between, realistic as in, like, factual historical versus realism, which is, does this make logical sense? And if the answer is, like, it doesn't make sense logically if you think about it, and I reject the idea that you can't think about these things logically and come to a conclusion about how they should work, in a fantasy setting, then what are we even doing, right?
That's
We're
interesting
just like,
question. Yeah. So I'll kind of restate it again for you for clarity's sake, Justin. So, we have Kings of War, and it is a game where you can find, I think, a pretty good level of success bringing just one type of unit, right? Just flying units or this. What does it say? Is that a good or bad thing, or is it a neutral thing that army can find success in this game? What does that say?
Well, I hear what Sam is saying. I think it's a good thing. In terms of, it lets you do. I mean, when you put it in the, like, there's this one best unit and you spam that, like, that stinks. But if that problem was solved, the more flexible build rules let you bring, like, interesting fluffy armies. Like, if you want to build an all night army, you could. If you want to build an all night goblin army, an all squig army, that kind of thing, you can do it. There's other ways to go about enabling that.
Mhm.
But if like, looking at my math, things were, if you were paying for things for their value, and that, let's say a big flying unit is worth 7 times what an infantry unit is worth. So you bring 5 of those flying units, and I bring 35 infantry units for the same price, right? So I spam my infantry, you spam your thing, but the points have been balanced out that their value output is the same. And there are other things to consider. Those numbers wouldn't actually be what happens. But in that case, like now we're playing about what if a whole bunch of infantry were fighting a whole bunch of flying guys in a balanced situation. Now it's
Yeah, no,
tactics.
you're absolutely right about that. I mean, and I agree with you. Is that if the point system is such that yeah, from a what if perspective, it can be fun to think about. Like let's say if I took my my 60 guys on Pegasus against 5,000 in goblins, right? I mean, that's a fun thing to do, and we could play that out as long as the system allows for that. Right now, but it's from a game balance perspective, right? The what should be the most kind of, if you have an army that does a little bit of everything, you have some fast units, some hold units, some shooting, some whatever, that in my mind, and maybe this is an unpopular opinion sometimes, that should be the best thing you could do, because then you're like an all comers list should be kind of the pinnacle of what the competitive meta is based off of.
And I think that's something that, and let me sort of just finish off with this, so to kind of close out here, and we'll pick it up again. Justin, love for you to come back on. Let's continue this discussion. But yeah, I think that's something, right? What is the game about and should be about when it comes to the need in the game, right? In other words, as Sam was saying, I need some shooting, I need some infantry, I need some fast people, I need some flyers, I need some tough people. I guess I would say, why? Why do you need those? Um, and as I listen to the discussion, I don't know. So I'm more on the neutral here. It's good that in this question we got a bad, a good, and for me, which I feel is sort of a neutral, I don't know. But appreciate your time.
It
We're
would
gonna
be fun
post.
to
Yeah,
pick up that conversation again
yeah,
later,
and
because I think that's a
that's
really
what I'd
interesting
like to
conversation
continue
to have.
on. I think take a step back and sort of see what is really going on with flying spam, or with def 6 spam, or with shooting spam. Anyway, thanks everyone. Any last thoughts, Justin? We'll give you the floor.
Oh, well, one thing now at the end, I can talk about my bad beats. I went at Lone Wolf, I keep saying it backwards, 1 win, 3 losses, and 1 tie. But one of my terror, so like a giant unit that I have, in game 1, turn 2, it took a couple wounds, and my opponent rolled double 6s and killed it. Game 2, turn 2, that same terror, because I have 2 of them, but the same model, took a couple wounds, the same amount of wounds. My opponent rolled double 6s and killed it.
Wow.
Game 3, he took less wounds, so he couldn't die. But my opponent rolled double 6s, turn 2, and wavered.
Wow.
Same model, turn 2, first 3 games. My opponent rolled, just did a penalty. It should have survived all of those. It should have survived 2 out of 3 of those for sure.
That's where that model
Turn
goes
2,
goes in the trash at the end of the game.
Speaking of auras, I
You're
had
opening up
aura.
some.
My
Yeah.
opponents rolled 6s. That's what I had in this tournament. My opponents rolled really well, and that poor giant died turn 2 every game.
Well, we're glad you have a fun. Hey, if anything else, like I said, wish I could have gone to Lone Wolf, but it's just unfortunate, just life. But thanks everyone, and until next time.
Any war game, anytime.